Tom Hanks arrived in the city to shoot a documentary about World War II veterans, a project deeply personal to him, as his father had shared stories of that era when Tom was a child. Typically, he stayed in luxurious downtown hotels, but this time he chose a modest four-star hotel in a quiet suburb to avoid paparazzi and noise. The lobby was silent, disturbed only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the muffled sound of a television in the corner playing ads for local restaurants. The clock read 11:15 p.m., and Tom had been waiting at the reception desk for half an hour. He pressed the bell several times, but there was no response. His fatigue from a long day of filming was gradually turning into irritation. He sighed, running a hand over his face, feeling tension grip his temples. It wasn't the first time he'd been made to wait. Finally, the door behind the counter opened, and a young woman rushed into the lobby, breathless, with disheveled hair and a badge that read, Emily. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, her eyes glistening with stress. She hurried to the desk, apologizing before she even stopped. "I'm so sorry, so sorry. I got held up. We had a situation," she said, her voice trembling as if she were holding back tears. Tom, ready to voice his frustration, looked at her more closely. Her hands shook as she typed on the keyboard, and her face showed signs of exhaustion. Dark circles under her eyes, pale skin. He held back the sharp words on his tongue and said dryly, "I waited 30 minutes. That's unacceptable." Emily looked up, her eyes filled with shame and panic. "I'm so sorry, sir. We're short-staffed and I was trying to manage. Your room is ready. Here's the key." She handed him a plastic card, her fingers nearly dropping it. Tom noticed how she quickly looked away, as if afraid he'd continue scolding her. He took the key, muttering something, and headed to the elevator, feeling a twinge of guilt for his tone, but also resentment. Didn't he deserve better treatment? The elevator creaked slowly to the 5th floor, and Tom's mind swirled with thoughts about how quickly the world forgets who you are when you're not on screen. The next morning, he turned on the news, and a story caught his attention. The anchor, with a serious expression, reported on a young woman who nearly died due to complications from a pregnancy. The camera showed a photo, a pale girl with dark hair in a hospital room, hooked up to machines. Tom froze. It was Emily. A young hotel worker in suburban Chicago, Emily Clark, was rushed to the ICU after collapsing at work. Doctors say the cause was a severe condition related to a pregnancy she had kept hidden. Her colleagues say she was working overtime to cover medical bills. Tom felt his throat tighten. He remembered her trembling hands, her apologies, her exhausted appearance. He turned off the TV, but the silence in the room became unbearable. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the empty parking lot where streetlights flickered. His anger at her, his irritation over the delay. It all seemed so trivial now. He thought about how often he, Tom Hanks, the man considered America's kindest actor, failed to notice others' pain, absorbed in his own problems. He felt shame, but also helplessness. How could one person fix the world's injustices? He packed his things, left a generous tip for the housekeeping staff, and left the hotel unsure if he'd ever return. But a small, firm resolve took root in his heart. He would no longer ignore those around him or allow himself to be indifferent. He got into a taxi and drove off. Tom Hanks stood before the glass doors of a hospital in suburban Chicago, his heart pounding, the cold autumn air biting at his cheeks. The smell of antiseptic hit him before he even stepped inside. The hospital was typical for a town like this, clean but worn, with faded blue chairs in the waiting area and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. After the news he'd seen, he couldn't allow himself not to help her. The image of Emily, hooked up to machines, her pale face on the screen, haunted him. Approaching the reception desk, where a young nurse in blue scrubs typed at a computer, he said quietly, "Good morning. I'm looking for Emily Clark," his voice soft but tinged with tension. The nurse looked up, her brows slightly raised, as if trying to recall if she'd seen him before. "Are you family?" she asked, her tone professional but weary. Tom shook his head. "No, I know her from work. I want to help." The nurse nodded, but her gaze grew suspicious. She's in the ICU. Visitation is restricted. I can pass on a message. Tom felt his throat tighten. He hadn't anticipated being turned away. I want to pay for her treatment, he said, pulling out his wallet. Whatever it costs, I'll cover it. The nurse froze, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. You'll need to speak with administration. I can call someone. 15 minutes later, Tom sat in the cramped office of the hospital administrator, an older woman with short gray hair and a stern expression. Her desk was cluttered with papers, the air smelling of old documents and a faint trace of her perfume. Mr. she prompted, waiting for a name. Tom hesitated for a moment before saying, Hanks. Tom Hanks. Her eyes widened, but she quickly composed herself. All right, Mr. Hanks. You want to cover Emily Clark's bills. It's a significant amount. Are you sure? Tom nodded, his fingers gripping the armrests of the chair. I want her to have everything she needs, and I want it done anonymously. The administrator sighed, as if she'd seen this before. That's generous, but I must warn you. Her condition is serious. Paying the bills doesn't guarantee that everything will be okay. The words hit Tom like cold water. He pictured Emily lying in a hospital bed, alone, without family, and felt his chest tighten. I understand. Just do it, he said, his voice quiet but firm. The administrator nodded and began filling out forms while Tom stared out the window at the gray Chicago sky, heavy as his thoughts. He imagined how he'd apologize to Emily if he could see her. I'm sorry I was harsh. I'm sorry I didn't see. But the words felt hollow when she was fighting for her life behind these walls. When the paperwork was done, the administrator said he'd be allowed a brief visit, provided he didn't disturb Emily. Tom agreed, though he wasn't sure what he'd say if he saw her. A nurse led him down a corridor smelling of disinfectant, the sound of footsteps mixing with the soft beeping of machines. In the ICU, Emily lay under a white sheet, her face pale, almost translucent, her dark hair splayed across the pillow. Tubes and wires snaked from her arms to monitors emitting a rhythmic beeping. Tom stopped at the door, not daring to step closer. His eyes misted, but he blinked quickly to keep the tears at bay. She's stable but weak, the nurse said softly. You can talk, but not for long. Tom nodded, but his tongue felt stuck to the roof of his mouth. He stepped closer to the bed, his hands trembling. Emily, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't see. She didn't respond, her eyes closed, her breathing barely noticeable. Tom stood there, the silence in the room oppressive, time stretching endlessly. He wanted to say more, but the words felt pointless. What could he say to someone who might not even hear him? He turned to the nurse. Does she have family? He asked. The nurse shook her head. No one's been here. She's alone. The words cut into Tom like a knife. He thought of how often he'd felt alone, despite the fame, the crowds, the wealth. But his loneliness was a choice. Hers was not. As he left the room, his legs felt heavy, each step requiring effort. In the parking lot, the taxi was still waiting, the driver scrolling through his phone, oblivious to Tom. Sliding into the back seat, Tom felt a mix of shame, anger, and something new, still unformed. He couldn't undo what had happened to Emily, but he could do more than just pay her bills. An idea took root. Find out why she was working in such conditions, why the hotel was in such a state, why no one noticed she needed help. He pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. Jane, get me the contact for the owner of the hotel I stayed at, and look into their working conditions. I want to know everything. The taxi pulled away toward the airport, but Tom knew this wasn't the end. He couldn't change the past, but he could ensure this didn't happen again. Staring at the gray buildings passing by, he thought, maybe this isn't just about Emily. Maybe it's about all the people he'd overlooked for years, lost in his own world. And this small step, his decision to act, was just the beginning. A little over a month later, Tom Hanks found himself back in Chicago. The hotel lobby looked different. Freshly painted walls, new carpets with soft pile, warm light from modern lamps replacing the old fluorescent flicker. But the most noticeable change was the atmosphere. The quiet hum of guests, the laughter of staff behind the counter, the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifting from a small cafe in the corner. Tom stood at the entrance, his hands in the pockets of his warm jacket, a mix of pride and anxiety swirling in his chest. In that month, he had done something he never imagined. He bought the hotel. It wasn't just an impulsive decision of a wealthy man. It was his way of righting what he saw as unjust, and perhaps finding peace for himself. After his hospital visit, after paying Emily's bills, he couldn't stop. His assistant, Jane, had gathered information about the hotel: chronic understaffing, low wages, pressure on workers who clocked 12-hour shifts without breaks. The owner, a distant businessman from Texas, cared only about profits. Tom had reached out through lawyers, and after weeks of negotiations, the hotel was his. He didn't plan to manage it himself, that's what managers were for, but he hired a new team, set higher salaries, provided health insurance for all staff, and established clear rules: no pressure, no humiliation. He wanted this place to be more than a hotel, a sanctuary where people could rest, feel safe, and forget their worries for at least one night. Tom stepped into the lobby and immediately spotted Emily behind the counter. She looked better than she had in the hospital. Her cheeks had a slight flush, and her eyes, though still carrying a hint of fatigue, glowed with warmth. Her dark hair was neatly tied back, and her badge now read, Emily Clark, Shift Manager. Tom paused, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. She had made it. The doctors had said her recovery was slow but steady, and after weeks in the hospital, she returned to work. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Tom approached the counter, and Emily looked up, her smile freezing as she recognized him. "Mr. Hanks," she said softly, her voice filled with surprise. "Emily," he replied, his tone gentle, almost hesitant. "How are you?" She shrugged, her fingers nervously touching her badge. "Better. Thank you. For everything." Tom knew she meant not just his hospital visit, but the changes in the hotel. He hadn't told her he was the new owner, but word had spread among the staff. "I hear you're managing shifts now," he said, trying to ease the tension. Emily nodded, her smile widening. "Yeah, I didn't think I'd come back here. But this place has changed. It feels warmer." Tom felt a warmth spread through his chest. He wanted to say more, to apologize again for that night he was harsh, but the words felt unnecessary. Instead, he asked, "Do you like working here?" Emily paused, her gaze sweeping across the lobby, where guests sat in cozy armchairs, and her colleague, a young man with a badge reading Jake, laughed while pouring coffee. "Yes," she said finally. "This place feels like somewhere I can breathe." They talked for a few more minutes, about her recovery, the new hotel policies, how she'd learned to delegate instead of taking everything on herself. Tom listened, feeling his anxiety slowly ebb away. He hadn't fixed everything that happened to Emily, but he'd given her a chance not just to recover, but to build a new life. As he said goodbye, she suddenly said, "You know, I've seen your movies. You always seemed like someone who gets people. Thank you for not just passing by." Tom only nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He stepped out of the hotel, the cold wind hitting his face, but this time it didn't feel so sharp. Sliding into the taxi, he glanced at the hotel's sign, now reading Haven for the Night. It was his idea, to rename it, to make it a symbol of rest and safety. He didn't know if he'd return here again, but he knew this hotel had become something more than just a building. It was his small contribution to a world that often felt unfair. As the taxi pulled away, Tom thought, maybe this wasn't the end of the story, but just its beginning. For Emily, for himself, for everyone seeking refuge in this world.